Stand, please.
And then one of you is going to start the pledge, is that right?
Please start the pledge.
Of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Now, how would you- Why don't we all stand and sing God Bless America. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. And we want to thank Girl Scout Troop number 41320, who came to do our flag ceremony today. This is their first time for doing it, and I think they did a wonderful job. And they're also going to earn their flag badge for coming and participating today. Well, Gerald Ford, one of our U.S. presidents, signed a federal law stating that Veterans Day was to go back to be the November 11th. They had changed it to be one of our Monday holidays, and he decided that it should be remembered on the day itself. And he said it's a day to reflect with solemn pride on the heroism of those who died in our country's service. And that's why we are here to celebrate our veterans today. Well, during World War II, the principal of Whitfield School in Sylvan Lake, Glenn Houston, wrote to the men and women in the service, those who had attended Whitfield School. The servicemen and women then wrote back to Mr. Houston, and then he shared in his next letter all the news from the previous letters. I wish I could. Anyway. And fortunately, Mr. Houston saved all of these letters. There were about 70 letters from 45 different people. Is that? Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get both of them. Okay. Today we're going to talk about some of those letters. And for the last year and a half, we have been returning the original letters to the men and women that wrote them, or to their families. And so far we have found 7 that are living, and we have found all but 10 of the families of the veterans that wrote the letters to Mr. Houston. And I've been the fortunate one to have the families come to our house to receive their letters and talk about their families, which has been very heartwarming. Well, the first person you see on the picture today is Sherry Houston. This is a daughter of Glenn Houston, and she's the one that sent me the letters about a year and a half ago. Because I'm the Sylvan Lake historian, I think she thought that I would find the veterans and return the letters. This was her idea. I've known Sherry probably most of my life. In fact, Sherry's about a few years older than I am, and she used to babysit with my sister and I. And another funny thing is that Pete and I are living in their home. We've lived Another key person in this story is Randy Rogers. Randy also attended Whitfield School when he was in elementary school, and he saw a post that I put on Facebook soon after I received the letters, and he said to himself, that sounds like something that I would like to get involved in. And so Randy had been in the service, and he was still working for the government and living in Seoul, Korea. So all of this has been done via the internet, back and forth, because Sherry also lives in Warren, Pennsylvania. So we have Seoul, Korea, Warren, Pennsylvania, and Michigan to deal with these letters. But Randy is the one that did all the research. He knows, he has Ancestry.com available at home and a zillion other websites and ways to find people that I never could have done. So we really give a lot of credit to Randy for helping us do this. Next, I want to show you Mr. Houston. This is Mr. Glenn Houston, who was a principal of Whitfield School from 1927 to 1948. And I was a student at Whitfield when he was there, and we all just loved him. You'll see from the letters how much those that wrote to him, how much they loved him, and how much they thought of him for doing what he did. This is what his daughter Sherry Houston said about him. I guess I would have to say my dad loved teaching. He enjoyed making a difference in the children's lives and watching them grow with the experiences. Daniel Whitfield School and Sylvan Lake were such intermingled entities that he thought of them as just one. Every day teaching was a different experience, and he learned as much as the kids did. He enjoyed his lifetime friendship with the students and their families, and was pleased to have continued relationship with their many long after their school days were over. I think of that he thought of his Whitfield kids as part of his extended family. The school gave Dad the flag that flew over the school for many years, and we flew it over our house until it disintegrated. And Mr. Houston got a little weepy that day. She wrote, this is from Sherry. This is a picture of Whitfield School as it was in the 50s. It was on Orchard Lake Road, a wonderful school, beautifully designed, and it held grades 1 through 8 at one point, and then after it joined contact schools, it was just K through 6th grade. Here is Mr. Houston in the kindergarten classroom with the children. Now we're going to go to this is the first letter that Mr. Houston wrote to his students, to the people that he started writing to. He said, and this was in 1943, Dear Joe, don't throw this away until I explain. Your name may not be Joe, but from now on you are one of the Joe Whitfields that I have been trying unsuccessfully to maintain correspondence with. We used to see you around here quite frequently, but some of you nearly every day, and over a period of about 9 years. Anyone who has come to be as well known as we know each other at school does not fade from my memory just because he happens to be out of sight for a time. Every day as I look over the students who are here at Whitfield now, I think of you fellows who used to be here, and I find myself wishing for some of the things that perhaps you too wish for, if you had time from your more important duties to spend on wishing. It is fruitful, of course, for me to hope to have you back for any more math classes, but I would like to repeat some of the other things we used to enjoy at school. And then he goes on to tell more about what's happening at the school. That was the beginning of his letter writing in 1943. here is his letter from 1944. And remember, he is talking about many of the things that the boys and girls, he talks about in this one about the service squad and the safety patrol, who is president of the class and so forth. But what I want you to read is, many of you will remember these pupils as just little kids. Others may not remember them at all, but they are all steamed up about their jobs. And I'm sure they will carry them on in the same fine manner that you people did when you were here. Nearly every one of you who has had time to write this summer has sent congratulations to the safety record of our school. These new officers are going to get a great boost when I read your messages. You can't blame them for feeling proud and happy when they do something that brings a bit of recognition and praise from persons who are as busy as you are on the biggest job that men have ever been called upon to do. And that would be to be in the service. And this is the third letter. He may have written more letters, but we know for sure, we have these 3 of his original letters, and he may have written more. He says, along with the usual studies in school this year, the students are attempting to carry on a few activities to assist in the international job you are doing. The total of stamps and bonds sold through the school thus far this year is just about $4,000. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have been assisting in the monthly pickup of waste paper. I believe the collections have averaged about 5 tons a month. There is very little paper burned at school anymore. Most of it is placed in cartons and stored until the next collection. We took almost half a truckload from school last Sunday. The local War Victory Committee, Mr. Philpins is chairman, which sponsors all of our salvage work, has been very generous with the money received for salvage turned in. Large contributions have gone to the Red Cross, USO, United War Fund, in addition to assisting the local Boy and Girl Scout troops. Tin collection has been rather slow this year in interest, tin collection has been rather slow this year in comparison with last. That is not because there's any shortage of interest or lack of willingness to gather it. The point values are so high on canned goods, and so much more is being canned in glass instead of tin. The homes are just not getting as much tin as they used to. Do any of you remember taking a tin can and taking out both ends and slide the ends inside and then standing on it to make it flat so that you could...
My father told me about it.
I used to do that, just to put,
Yes.
to reduce it so it fit in the trash properly.
Yes. So, one thing I did not tell you, though, about Mr. Houston is that when he was a child, Mr. Houston had polio, and his right arm was withered, so he could only type with his left hand. And he had to go to Whitfield School to type on the typewriter there because they did not have a typewriter at home. And his daughter, Sherry, would go with him to run the messages off on their mimeograph machine at the school. But you can imagine addressing 45 or more letters to these men in the service during this time and all the work that they did. Well, this is a advertisement to buy war bonds. And this is something that Mr. Houston sent around to the teachers almost at the very end of the year in 1944. They were $207 short of $10,000 in collecting money for the war bonds that year. That would be about almost $132,000 in our money today. That is pretty remarkable for a small school with about 200 students in a small area. So they really were behind the war effort. Now we're going to go on to read some of the letters from the people that wrote to Mr. Houston. This first one is from Fred Beadle. And Fred is one of the veterans that we found is still living. He's living in Florida. And he writes, I have been studying a long time, and last month I took my final exam for second class petty officer. I was notified yesterday that I had made it. It pays me $96 a month, which isn't so bad. I had planned to come home for Christmas or New Year's, but it is impossible for me now. And I will probably have to wait until next June or July. Here's one from Wilbur Cook, who writes, "Everything is fine here in Italy. I'm in the best of health and I enjoy my work as much as can be expected under the present conditions. I'm glad to see that you had the traditional potluck at the end of your Friday night games. I'm sure all the old timers always look forward to it, but we sure didn't like to see the end of our weekly basketball games. The boys used to gather every Friday night and play basketball at the school gym. And one of the fellows came to my house and said, I remember coming up the steps to this house, Mr. Houston would give me the key and let me go over and open the school so we could play games. Now, that wouldn't happen today, but that's how much he trusted them. Now, I have an original letter because Bob Cox, this is from Bob Cox. Here's a picture of Bob Cox, and you'll see other pictures in front of his house. Mr. Bob Cox lived across the street from the Houstons, and his mother took a picture of almost all of the men before they went into the service. There's lots of pictures with the men in their uniforms. And there's a picture of Mr. Houston and Bob standing in front of the school. And you can see in that picture how his hand rests against the side of him. But this would be very frustrating what Bob's talking about, but I want you to hear this. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Houston. Last week was the toughest week I have had yet. I will tell you briefly what we did. Monday, we worked on fixed bridges, which are bridges that are built across ravines. Tuesday morning, we had conditioning exercises and our orientation lecture. In the afternoon, we had movies on the identification of airplanes. Wednesday at 6 a.m., we started on our 30-mile hike with full field packs. I don't know how much that would weigh, but I'm sure it was heavy. We arrived at our destination, the Colorado River, at 6 o'clock p.m. About 10 fellows dropped out, but I made the hike without any blisters. My feet were sore, but not like the majority of the boys. We pitched our tents and went to bed. Thursday, we built our pontoon bridge, 3/4 of the way across the river, which is 400 feet. And then we took the bridge down. Can you imagine? After mess that night at 8 o'clock, we started building the bridge in the dark. About 1 a.m. in the morning, a storm came up and we had to stop work on the bridge. Friday morning, we tore the bridge down, and in the afternoon, we built a ferry raft across the river. Saturday morning, we had full field inspection in the field. The inspection didn't come up to their standards, so we restricted our passes for the weekend. Today, Sunday, I had to stand a bunk inspection before I could leave the company area. I haven't been able to weigh myself since I've been in the service in the Army, but I believe I have gained a few pounds. I know that the fat fellows have all lost weight. Isn't that cute? So he was in Texas and they had to march to the Colorado River. That is really amazing to me. Here's a letter from Bob Dixon from January 1944. I'm glad to hear that the bond selling was a big success. Please keep up the good work. I'm afraid that after this is over, the people are going to need the bonds and any other form of cash. I can't help but think there are some rough days ahead. Well, keep up the good basketball games, and one of these days we'll come down and play a couple of games just for old time's sake. Another year and a half to 2 years, you'll see the fellows rolling home to stay. That is, with a little luck. Bye for now, Bob. And here's another one from Bob Dixon. I'm glad to hear that the safety patrol is still going strong. I hope they never have any bad breaks. That is almost a tradition. I remember the first trophy the school received and how darn proud everyone was. It seems everyone is looking forward to the reunion, as I am. I'll settle for a lot less than steak. The food doesn't much matter. Being in on it is important to me. Several of them talked about a reunion when they got home from World War II. This picture shows a typical letter that Mr. Houston received. You can see that this was sent to the school. But what I wanted you to see that all of the letters were censored. That meant someone from the government read each letter and decided whether it was safe to let them send it or not. You can see down in the bottom right-hand, left-hand corner that it has been stamped and has been read by somebody in the government. Most of the letters had that on them. Here's a card and a letter from Chuck Dreyer. He said, "Received your letter a few days ago and thought it was swell. It's real now. It's really novel. I get quite a kick out of reading all about all the fellows in the village that we used to know. I hope that someday all of us can get together at Daniel Whitfield School. I get letters now and then from Bob Cox and Ronnie Kilmer. You probably guessed by now, my pride and joy is a B-24, which was a bomber." And here's one from Bob Burrell. "I grew up living next door to Bob Burrell. I've been at Whitfield as well, and so I knew some of these fellows. But Bob Burrell lived next door, and I was about 5 years old when he went off to the war. And he was so handsome in his uniform, and I wanted to marry him. He was a wonderful family, and I got together with his 4 children to give them his letters, and they were thrilled to have the original letters that he wrote. But he said, I've been razzed a lot about being a Boy Scout, but I don't mind. I know my officer asked me one day if I was a scout, as I could do several things that the others couldn't. He told me he was an Eagle Scout and proud of it, so that set the other fellows back a bit. I'm training to be a driver. We have to make maps, which I learned a little bit about while I was in Troop 27, and now I'm very glad I went as far as I did in scouting." Okay, and this is a very special picture because we have Jim Coates with us today. He is one of the men that went to Whitfield and went to World War II. This is a picture, Jim is on the left, his father Proctor is in the middle, and his brother Harold. And Harold is living in Florida. So I want to read a special letter that Proctor Coates wrote to Mr. Houston. And Proctor was in his 40s at this time. And we're going to have Jim tell you what special reason that his father was called to go into the service. So Mr. Coates and Mr. Houston were about the same age. "Say, Glenn, I passed word to Mike Myers to get a hold of Harold, his son, and tell him to keep his mother home Thursday evening between 8:30 and 9:30, by hook or by crook, if you get this on Thursday. Will you tell Mary Lou, their daughter, the same thing for insurance? It's our 21st wedding anniversary on April 22nd, and I want to call her on the phone. I hope I don't get all choked up and can't talk. I really couldn't sing in church on Sunday, but I felt a lot better afterwards. It doesn't seem possible that I'm on my 4th week already. 6 months will soon roll by, and then I'll be eligible for captaincy. I sure will work hard anyway, but it is so nice to feel you are making progress. I hope everything is fine with you, and thanks again, Proctor." So we can assume that his wife was home when he called to wish her happy anniversary. Here's a picture and Jim brought the original today. Jim Coates, who's sitting here in the front row, is in the back seat of this airplane on a training session. And to have an open cockpit like that looks a little bit scary to me. But he might tell us more about that. Here's a letter from Jean Levy. It says, "Dear Mr. Houston, once again I'm writing to thank you for the form letter you sent to me, and this time accompanied by the Christmas program. If you only knew how much pleasure is derived from reading about the activities of your old schoolmates, You would have the presses rolling 24 hours a day. And then in 1944, the city, or the village of Sylvan Lake, sent a Christmas card to all of the men and women in the service. And this was the cover. This lists the Veterans Committee. We talked about that earlier. Oh, no, not yet. Maybe not. It does talk about Mr. Houston and various people that lived in the village at that time. And here's the message that they sent, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. They sent them 6 pictures, and they would know where all but one of them was. The top left is a picture from Whitfield School. That is all the teachers, and the man with the hat is Mr. Gilchrist, who was the custodian at the school. You can barely see Mr. Houston, actually the 4th from the left, peering behind, he's standing behind 2 of the teachers. But I've had many of those teachers myself. The picture on the top right is the Oakland County Boat Club. The picture in the middle on the left is the Detroit Free Press Fresh Air Camp. And the one on the right is the shoreline of along Ferndale Street, along Lakeview Street in Sylvan Lake, where they used to swim. And the one on the bottom left is the one that they probably didn't know where it was. That is now our Ferndale Beach. But before they went to the service, that was just the swamp. It had 3 or 4 canals going from the lake to the road. And so it was all filled in the 1940s. So that would be a new thing for them to see when they came back home. And then the picture on the bottom right is our Sylvan Lake City Hall. So that was a nice thing to give the boys something to remember from at home. And then since we started this project a year and a half ago, last summer I had the pleasure of having lunch with these fellows. On the left is Marvin Howell, and then Jerry Stoll. He was not in the service, but he was a good pal at Whitfield School. And then Jim Coates who is here with us today, and Lyle Philpott, and they all lived nearby each other in Sylvan Lake. So I talked to all of them, and we want to get together for lunch again soon. Here's a letter from Lyle Philpott. Okay, here we go. Your last communique certainly had a lot of news I've been waiting to hear. Gosh, you must have a whale of a bookkeeping job, keeping everyone tagged. Your files are just about complete, it seems. Nearly everyone is overseas or pretty close to it. I'm still laughing about that piano moving incident. Let me tell you about that. It seems that several boys, including Marvin Cole, were making a map of South America on the floor in the gym. And they needed more space because it was a large map. And so they decided they would just move the piano a little bit. But the gym had linoleum, and the piano had kind of sunk into the linoleum. And when they pushed it, it fell over. Well, somebody ran to get Mr. Houston because they were all worried about what was going to happen. They thought they were really going to get it. But Mr. Houston came down to the gym, and he was more concerned about the boys than he was about the piano, which was very typical of him. So that's what happened, and he does refer to that in his letters, Mr. Houston does. And here's Marvin Cole, and he says, here's hoping this letter finds you in good health, and also Mrs. Houston and Sherry. I received your letter about a month ago, and I feel like a heel for not writing you before this. I certainly enjoyed your letter with the news of the village and all the fellows. I was surprised that you still remember the time Johnny and I upset that piano. Time sure does fly. So it was one of those things that you remember from your childhood. Here's a letter from Howard Sturdy, and he writes, let's see, this, doesn't have, here, 1944. I received your swell letter today and really enjoyed reading it. I let the fellows in my crew read it, and they thought it was swell of you to write a letter like that. And they wish that someone they know would write the same kind of letter to them. When you get some more time, I sure would like to hear from you again. Now, have you been noticing how many times they use the word swell? It must have been a typical 1940s expression. Here's a letter from Raymond Lloyd Taylor from 1945. I have my plane now. I am on my last lap, so to speak. We will finish up here around the 5th of June, and then from then on, it's anybody's guess. Yesterday, we dropped our first bombs and scored 12 hits out of 13 bombs, which isn't too bad for the first try. The B-29 sure is a swell ship. I like it better all the time. I'm just reading parts of these letters. Here's one from Ed Bond. It just says July the 6th. Well, I've been in the Army for 3 weeks now. In the camp, a week and a half. 1,000 of us from colleges, and theoretically, we will be sent back after 13 weeks or so. Those of us who are living. After 1 week from our barracks, 60 are in our barracks of 60, there are 3 in the hospital. One somewhere is mentally incompetent at the time. I'm surprised there aren't more in the same boat. Boy, in 1 week, they gave us a better mental and physical beating than I've ever come near to before. They say that the first 3 weeks are the worst. Got one of them packed away. And Ed Vaughn was in college, and I'm sure that he did go back because he went on to become a doctor. And this is Mike Steer, who actually grew up living next door to Mr. Houston. By now you have read in the papers or heard on the radio that the Nevada, a ship, participated in the invasion of Hiroshima. After the preliminaries were completed, we moved on to the forward area to wait the time when we would participate in the pre-invasion day of bombardment. At dawn on the scheduled day, we approached the island of Hiroshima along with other units of the fleet and opened fire with our heavy guns. Incidentally, the Nevada had the honor of firing the first shot. This preliminary shelling lasted for several days, and we were proud and pleased to see that they were effectively knocking out Jap installations such as pillboxes, blockhouses, and anti-aircraft gun emplacements. We have no idea the number of Japs we killed, but we did see several go down under our own fire. Which must have been very, very hard. Here is a Christmas card that that Bob Gibson sent home, and I thought it was neat that it showed different branches of the service. Here's a letter from Gary Schroeder. It certainly sounds good to hear the way the villagers are behind the home front war effort. It helps the morale of the soldiers from the village a lot. Hope they keep up the good work. I know they will. We are all hoping for a speedy victory and return home. Speaking of those Friday night periods, Mr. Houston, it reminds me of the last furlough I had, and I dropped in and looked at old times over. Sure wish I could be there to participate in those basketball games. You can just feel the way they feel about Mr. Houston and also about playing basketball together. Here's a letter from Jack Zander. And he says, after spending the last 8 months with the 76th Division, I have finally decided to try and become an air cadet in the glorified Air Corps. They have lowered the requirements, both physical and mental, and I think I can now make it. To get in, I need 3 letters of recommendations, and I'd be grateful if you would write one for me. Thank you ever so much, Jack Zander. This is a picture that was taken after the men returned from the war. This, the house on the right is a house that we now lived in. That was Mr. Houston's house. And the house on the left is where Chet Hall lived. Now the man on the left is Mike Steer, who lived on the other side of Mr. Houston's house. Then is Chet Hall, Jack Zander, and Bob Cox. And they all lived within 3 or 4 houses of each other. They couldn't wait to get home from the war to buy a brand new car. And Chet Hall is standing in front of his brand new convertible. He's the one that gave me the picture and told about how fun, how they were so interested in getting a brand new car. Another thing, well, this is where they collected the tin cans and any salvage, any metal that they could. And this was the first sign that the city put up to honor the men that were in the service. And then this sign was later put up that shows the names of all those in the service. Another thing they did in Sylvan Lake was have victory gardens. One of the reasons for victory gardens is that the farmers, many of them were sent off to the war, and they couldn't farm their fields. Their wives were left at home. But another reason is that gasoline was rationed, and they couldn't get enough to even bring the produce into the cities to sell it. So they had, wherever there was a vacant lot, the city would allow them to have their own plot and grow their own vegetables. And these are just a couple of pictures from a little booklet that one of the men sent home. And so we want to thank the men and women that have served our country and for the freedom that we enjoy today. We want to thank Mr. Houston for writing to all these men and women in the service, for sharing the letters with us, for Randy Rogers, for finding all the people they did, and for the Girl Scout troop, number 41320, for coming to do the flag ceremony with us today. And so I just want one more thing. During World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, carried this prayer in her purse, perhaps as a reminder of the sacrifices being made around the world. Dear Lord, lest I continue my complacent way, help me to remember somewhere out there a man died for me today. As long as there be war, I then must ask and answer, am I worth dying for? So let's continue to pray for our men and women of today and tomorrow who are protecting our country and each of us as they serve in the armed forces around the world. So that's the story, and there are many, many, many more letters, but that's the story of some of them. So I know that Jim Coates is here, and he's one of the men that went to Whitfield School, and his brother and father were also in World War II. So we'll ask Jim to come up, and then if anyone, and then Eric is here, and he can tell us about his time in Vietnam.
Very nice.
Yes, I lived in Sylvan Village, and the word Sylvan, if your children ever want to look it up in a book, it means everything good that you could ever imagine. It was a beautiful place to live. Obviously, the memories of it were pretty heavy. I have two parts today to give to you. The first part is a little bit of information about what happened to the people in America when the war started and as the war went on. And the basis of it is that during the period of Pearl Harbor to the finish in Japanese waters when they signed the agreement to no more wars, 26 million and some Americans served in the service. That's a lot. At any one time, there was 9 million. Well, the point of the 26 million, can you imagine the movement that caused? It just wasn't my brother who went, and we all stayed there. My father went, and my mother sold the house, and she followed my father. And I stayed with some friends and neighbors, and went to 3 high schools and 1 junior high in 4 years. My lovely wife, Kathleen, is here in the front row. And from the time I was 14 until I was 23, I lived with my family 6.5 months. Don't think that's unusual. That's what happened in World War II. Those are the kinds of people that did the things they had to do so that you could be here today, so that we could have these great buildings, nice towns, and all the other things of life that we enjoy. It wasn't an easy thing for the folks at home, and it wasn't an easy thing for the ones that went. It was hard. It was hard. Yet everybody they were up for it. Everybody was pretty happy. Everybody worked pretty hard. I had an uncle in Holly who delivered the fuel oil for the people in town who needed fuel oil, and worked 2 shifts, evening and nights, at Pontiac Truck, making war materials. And he wasn't unusual. That happened over and over and over. I'm sure you've heard about Rosie the Riveter. There were many, many, many Rosie the Riveters. We started building ships to send supplies to Europe and to the Pacific, because when you put millions of people out, you have to have all kinds of things. And if you make a list of them, you'd say, well, yes, you want to get some guns and some bullets, and you got to get some uniforms and some troops. Well, you need a lot more than that. You need pie plates and shoelaces, and you need kinds of polish and cleaners, and you just need everything in the world. You need maps, and the way to get them there is in a ship. They were called Liberty ships. And one man developed and designed them, and they built them, most of them, along the Mississippi River. And with the help of a lot of ladies, they got up to where they were building 1 ship a day. And it was a big ship, 517 feet long, 1 engine, could carry many, many tons of cargo. And it started out early in the morning as a piece of steel with a keel. And by nightfall, it rolled down the waves and went down the Mississippi. And huge number, hundreds of ladies helped in that endeavor. There are so many stories, it's so hard to tell. Sometimes things got really bad when you didn't hear from people. So that's what was pretty nice of Mr. Houston, to start doing what he started doing. His communications to everybody helped. It helped more than you can imagine. I'm sure, if you think about it, he probably had the first internet service in America. I know. It didn't buzz and click, and you couldn't look at it and play with it. But you know what it gave you? It gave you a message. And that's what internet does today. It gave you a message about those people that you were interested in. It gave you a message about your home. It gave messages about the people and what they were doing. Like when I talked about my dad that made the telephone call. Back then, we were on our honor on many, many things. One of them was long-distance calling. You had to have a very good reason to make a long-distance call, or you couldn't make it. And it was after the war when my father had told me about, he had to ask 3 times, and finally had to go to a colonel to get permission to call his wife on the 21st anniversary. That's the kind of guy Dad was. He wouldn't do it on the slide. He had to get permission because it was an important thing. My brother, he's the one here, is an interesting person in the Army. A normal division in the Army would have 12 to 14,000 soldiers. And you think in terms of, boy, that's a whole lot of soldiers. However, a few of them, 2,200 to 4,000 at the most, were called riflemen. And they were known as those at the point of the spear. That comes from Roman days. In other words, 14,000 people never fought. It'd be the widest, biggest battle zone you ever saw. It was 2,200 or 4,000 riflemen who did the fighting. Even though there were tanks in the division, believe it or not, the riflemen went ahead of the tanks. That sounds like a tough job, doesn't it? And it was a tough job. We lost so many riflemen that they were back here in the Selective Service Board, had opened it up. They took people that were up to 38 years of age. They took people that couldn't see out of one eye. They took people that didn't hear too well. They took people with bad feet. And in the first part of the war, none of those people could get through the Selective Service process. At the last part, all of them could get through it. In fact, they were out looking for them. Why? Because those riflemen up front, they're the ones that took the brunt. They're the ones that were killed. Like at the Battle of the Bulge, one whole company of riflemen was killed. How? The Germans captured them, lined them up in a field, and machine gunned them. And they thought they had a real good reason for doing that. They had no place to keep them and didn't want them to eat their food because they didn't have much. So they lined the company up, 76 or 78 guys, and machine gunned. It's tough to be a rifleman. My dad was a different story entirely. He was a genius, only word put to it. He was a hero. He helped people. When people didn't know where to get something, didn't know what to do, or didn't know where to go, all of a sudden he would show up at the door with a truck or something. And whatever they needed, he had. He made it his business to know to help people. He got a call from the president of Bell Labs, who had heard from President Roosevelt about the Signal Corps. And the president of Bell Labs told my dad, he said, President Roosevelt said, on the battlefield, in the oceans, we signal and communicate with each other by waving flags and blinking lights. And he said, we'd like you to bring your Bell Labs and Western Electric people in and redo the Signal Corps so that we can talk to each other. And one of the first people the president called was my father, because my father was that kind of a guy. He could just come up with the answer. I'll take you forward many, many years what was called a DEW line up in Canada when we were afraid that the Russians were going to come across that DEW line and drop atomic bombs on us. They were huge, huge domes with great big radar installations in them. And Dad was sent up to inspect several of them for pieces of AT&T equipment. And he got to this one, and the roof was in like this. It was filled with ice and snow. And they were afraid that it was going to collapse. So they told Dad, he said, well, we don't want you to go in there right now. We're waiting. He said, what are you waiting for? He said, we're waiting for a crane. He said, we got to lay some track, some extra track, because the crane is 150 feet long. So we take it apart, but it's still big. And it'll take another week or two to get here. And Dad said to one of the soldiers, he said, do any of you have trench guns, which is a shotgun, a great big shotgun, 10 gauge or 8 gauge? And he said, yes. And he said, why don't you bring it here? And Dad went in and shot holes. And the water went out. And the dome went back up. And they stopped the train and sent it back. But I think that's a simple, simple thing to do. But how many men stood around up there and ordered great, huge things to solve this problem when you could solve it, boom, boom. And that was my father. He solved problems. The one that he liked and the one he went overseas with, he saw a guy, a soldier, shooting a rifle with a grenade in it. And it looped up and went 500 or 600 feet, and that's a lot further than you can throw a grenade by hand. And Dad got this idea. He thought, why can't I put a little wire where that grenade is? Shoot that little wire to the next foxhole or company commander. Have a handset on each end they plug in, and they can talk to each other, and the runners don't have to get killed. And the enemy doesn't have to find out what message you have, because if they find out what the message is, that might be bad news for you. And as things go, as feedback came, he kind of became convinced that when the fighting started, people weren't really using these things. They were using their guns. They wanted to see a lot. They wanted some food, they wanted some water, they wanted some medical advice. And so he talked his colonel into letting him go to the Pacific. Now he's 43 years old. And he landed on 3 islands. The first island, they wouldn't let him go ashore until the 5th day, which upset him terribly. The first day on that island, we lost 9,000 fighters in one day. The second landing, they kind of gave in to him a little bit and let him go on the 3rd day. Well, on the first day on that island, we lost 11,000 men. He finally made it very clear that he wanted to go ashore on the first day. So on Okinawa, they let him go ashore on the first day, the first wave. And he said, we got lucky. I want you young people to listen to this. Just listen. We got lucky. We only lost 1,700 men that day. That's what war is about. And that's why we should stay out of them forever and ever. Many families went in the service, many. Maybe you've read about the Sullivans. 4 boys lived on a farm out west. All went down on the same ship, all died together. And they had a movie. And in the movie, it was really more than you could bear. The military cars pulled up in front of the farmhouse. And Mrs. Sullivan had seen them. And she kind of knew. But she was thinking, which boy? Which boy did I lose? And then they told her all. So we were more than fortunate to have 3 go and 3 come home. I don't know why those things happened. My brother fought in 6 battles, wounded twice. My father went ashore, as he said, well, I only went ashore on 1 island. They wouldn't let me go on the first day on the other ones. Boy, I'm glad they didn't. And I managed to get all the way through my training, and my next assignment would have been to a ship. And they decided not to fight anymore. And that always made me feel real good. I told my brother and my father, look at the contribution I made. When I came in, they quit. And my dad would say, I'm glad you did. It was time we came home. I have a few words here I'd like to finish with. They're kind of grim in a way. It's from a book. Rick Atkinson wrote it. It's a study of history. I love history. There's nothing better than history. And what he outlined in the very last part of his book, all of it as true as can be, is how we sent men over and then how we brought them back. Some came back on a ship, bands playing and banners waving, and had a good time. Others didn't come back that way. Let me tell you how they came back. In 1947, the next of kin of 270,000 identifiable American dead buried overseas would submit Quartermaster General Form 345 to choose whether they wanted their soldier brought back to the United States or left interned with comrades abroad. About 60% decided they would bring them back. The Joseph B. Conley, the first of 21 ghost ships to sail from Europe, steamed down the Scheldt with 5,060 dead soldiers in her hold. 30,000 Belgians bade them adieu from the Antwerp docks, while pledging to look after the 61,000 Americans who would remain in 10 European cemeteries. One man from Antwerp said, we vowed and treated their tombs as if it was our children. And I'm sure they did. On Saturday, October 27th, just to follow the story, the Conley berthed in New York. Stevedores went the caskets from the ship 2 at a time, in specially designed slings. Most then traveled by rail in a great diaspora across the Republic for burial in hometowns. Among those waiting was Henry A. Wright, a widower who had lived on a farm in southwestern Missouri, near Springfield. One by one, his dead sons arrived at the local train station. Sergeant Frank H. Wright, killed on Christmas Eve, 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge. Then Private Harold E. Wright, who had died of wounds in a German prison camp, February 3rd, 1945. And finally, Private Elton E. Wright, killed in Germany on April 25th, 2 weeks before the war ended. Gray and stooped, the elder Wright watched as the caskets were carried into the rustic bedroom where each boy had been born. They were home. Neighbors kept vigil overnight, carpeting the floor with roses, and in the morning they bore the brothers to Hilltop Cemetery for burial side by side. Soldiers who survived also would struggle to reconcile the greatest catastrophe in human history with what the philosopher and Army officer J. Glenn Gray called the one great lyric passage in their lives. The war's intensity, camaraderie, and sense of high purpose left many with a deplorable nostalgia. In the phrase of H.A. Liebling, "The times were full of certainty," Liebling later wrote. "I have seldom been sure I was right since." An Air Force crewman who completed 50 bomber missions observed, "Never did I feel so much alive. Never did the earth and all the surroundings look so bright and sharp." And a combat engineer mused, "What we had together was something awfully damn good." Something I don't think we'll ever have again as long as we live. They have been annealed, touched with fire. We are certainly no smaller men than our forefathers, Gavin wrote. Alan Moorhead, who watched the Scarlet Calamity from beginning to end, believed that here and there, a man found greatness in himself. The anti-aircraft gunner in a raid and the boy in a landing barge really did feel at moments that the thing they were doing was a clear and definite good. The best they could do, and at these moments, there was a surpassing satisfaction, the sense of exactly and entirely fulfilling one's life. This thing, this brief ennoblement, kept recurring again and again up to the end, and it refreshed and lighted the whole heroic and sordid story. No war is really over until the last veteran is dead, the rifleman in the 26th Division would conclude. And then he says of the 16,112,566 Americans in uniform during the Second War, the number still living was expected to decline by a million by late 2014. So next year, sometime late in the year, we'll have 1 million of the 26 million left. 10 years later, in 24, we're going to, they say, have dipped below 100,000. And then by the year 2036, I can't imagine that. I was one of the younger people who went in the service. I can't imagine I could live to 2036. U.S. government demographers say that veterans, 400 veterans would remain alive, less than half the strength of an infantry battalion today. Yet the war and all the war contained, nobility, villainy, immeasurable sorrow, is certain to live on even after the last old soldier has gone to his grave. May the earth lie lightly on his bones. May God bless and protect those men and women in service today who stand between we and the evil in the world. Thank you.
Very good.
Next, we're going to have Eric Wiegand, who also lives in Sylvan Lake, and he served in the Vietnam War.
the Vietnam War wasn't a very popular war. And my most unhappy moment was coming home from the war, and they told us that we had to wear civilian clothes because flying into the U.S. there was a lot of unrest and people angry about the war. And I think the Vietnam War was the first war that the last war that men got drafted in. And I was teaching down at Wayne University and working 8 hours a day for an advertising agency and teaching 4 hours a night to stay out of the draft. More? It's not loud enough? Okay. Anyway, I was working at Campbell Ewald and teaching at night. And it was just too much after a year, and I was trying to stay out of the Army or the war. And I got drafted, and I was number 1 in the whole country for getting drafted. So, and I went down south. I'll just tell you a little bit. I went down south as a private for 1 year, and I was doing all kinds of things that I didn't like to do, like I was, they were demeaning you as much as they could as a private. So I decided I better become an officer. And at the time I was dating a general's daughter, and he said, why don't you apply for a direct commission? So I applied for a direct commission, and I went to Europe. I went to New York City to study film, and then went to Europe as in charge of a crew filming in Europe. And I thought, oh, this is really great while the war is going on, and they were flying us all over and everything. And the minute the year was up, I went immediately to Vietnam. And I spent the first 7 months in Pleiku, which was an outpost at the top of a mountain, and there was a lot of Agent Orange around there. I don't know if you know about that, but Agent Orange is very bad for your health. And a lot of men that have come back have had troubles with that. And anyway, we did combat photography, and then I also, a lot of people wrote letters, like back to their families and whatever. And I don't believe ours were censored. I think there were too many men over there. And when we weren't doing combat photography, we were trying to help the local natives, I guess is what you'd call them. And I have some pictures, and it was very primitive. Like, this is a shot of a man doing an arrow. And we would go in and we would give them food and some rations and things. They were very, very poor. And the women all were dressed, they were mostly bare-breasted above, and then they would wrap themselves in a blanket, and they would also sleep in the blanket. And this woman that I befriended a little bit, wove me this blanket, and if you look at it very closely, she put planes in here and Vietnamese men marching with their flags and a rows of bombs and everything. And then it was almost like a sleeping blanket. Anyway, we had a couple of many hard experiences, and I think that's about all I want to say. Do you have any questions?
Where was Pleiku?
It was in northern Vietnam.
In North Vietnam or just northern South Vietnam?
Oh, northern South Vietnam.
All right, thank you.
We did a lot of various things, like Nixon was president then, and he said no, there are no Americans going into Cambodia or North Vietnam, and we were dressing up in civilian clothes, and we were flying in there, you know, so it was an interesting time.
In your filming, what was that used?
Oh, basically the films, that was censored, and we only allowed photographs and films to come back to the U.S. for nightly news, but that was quite censored. And I ended up, the war was turning down in the late '69, early '70s, and I worked at the Southeast Asia Pictorial Center, and we had 600 men there that were filming still photography, motion picture photography. But we lost I didn't realize World War II had so many men killed. What was it, 247,000 or something?
270,000 were
Wow.
identified. There were many, many, many that were not identified. Later on in the war, if you remember the Merchant Marine, the federal government took a responsibility there, and there was, another 120,000. So the ship went down and nobody saw it, nobody saw the people, and they were gone.
Because I know Vietnam had 55,000 or 56,000 killed. And nowadays, medicine has advanced so far that I've been going down to the VA hospital, and it's very, very sad to see these young kids coming back and missing a limb or whatever, but it's amazing how, with all the wars that have been going on in the last, few years, how many men have been saved. And I hope everybody appreciates it.
There's a fearful disconnect. When we listened to you talking, it was everybody. It was the mothers. It was the fathers. It was the brothers. It was the people who worked in order to keep the munitions going.
Right.
When we went to Vietnam, it was only the people that were protesting.
Alan, go over to the microphone.
And I guess just sitting back there, it really struck me that even now, as we go on, and all we do now is we watch on the television. People are sitting in the United States shooting and killing people that are halfway around the world. We all still need to be as involved as you were. We all still need to make the sacrifices you did and the commitment that you made if we're going to keep the freedom you gave us.
You're right.